Good evening. My name is Joe Isles, and welcome to the Disruptive Innovation Festival 2015, curated by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. The Disruptive Innovation Festival is 3 weeks of face-to-face, online, and open sessions inviting thought leaders, entrepreneurs, businesses, makers, learners, and doers to ask the question, the economy is changing, what do I need to know, experience, and do? So it's Diff Day 3. I hope you've managed to get involved with some of the live sessions that we've held over the past few days. Yesterday we heard about the opportunities between and the links between 3D printing and the open source movement. We heard how you can grow your own bones with EpiBone, and we had a fantastic headliner session, the first of the Diff, with Robin Chase on the collaborative economy. That's available to catch up on online if you missed the session yesterday. But now we're here for today's headline act. And I'd like to remind you how you can get involved in this session. The Diff is all about interaction, and there are a number of ways that you can submit your comments, your questions, and just let us know what's on your mind during the session. 3 ways to do that. So you can do it via Twitter, you can use the hashtag ThinkDiff, or you can mention the Diff using @ThinkDiff with an underscore. You can use the comment section below the Google Hangouts window that you're likely watching this in now, or you can click Be Part of the Conversation in the Google Hangouts video player. It's a little yellow tab that pops up, and you can use the built-in Q&A app to submit your questions. And my colleague Seb will be here throughout the session picking those questions and sending them through to ask our headline speaker. And we look forward to hearing from you throughout the session. So, design. I'm willing to bet that pretty much every session that we've had here at the Diff this year so far has mentioned design in some way or another. It's something that perhaps some of us take a bit for granted these days. We're surrounded by products that are said to be aesthetically pleasing, and we comment that they have good design. Businesses are seeing it as a really core part of their strategy, and then others are incorporating design at the systems level, thinking about cities and whole systems. So what do we actually mean by design, and how and where can we apply design thinking? Well, today we're joined by Tim Brown, the CEO of IDEO, to help us answer some of these questions. Tim's a leading voice on the value of design thinking in business and society, chairing the WEF Global Agenda Council on the Creative Economy, and sharing insights on design with TED audiences and Fortune 500 companies and not-for-profits. His book, Changed by Design, has been described as the definitive book on design thinking. So Tim, thank you for joining us today from New York.
Thanks, Joe. It's great to be with everybody.
And just so we're all clear, right off the bat, what do we actually mean by design thinking?
So really, design thinking is a way of describing the collection of mindsets and tool sets that creative people, that designers have accumulated over time to tackle the kinds of challenges that they've traditionally faced, but then with the idea that we can then apply those mindsets and tool sets to a broader set of problems. So roughly these the tools fall into 3 categories of tools that we use for inspiration. Where do we get our insights and ideas from? Tools that we use for ideation. How do we develop new ideas, evolve them, experiment with them, test them, and then how do we implement those ideas? What does it take to get those ideas out into the world so that they have impact? And that, they vary to some degree from application to application. So, for instance, if we're designing a service, we might use a slightly different set of ideation tools than if we're designing a product, for instance. But in general, they're a simple set of tools that traditionally were owned by this kind of priesthood of professional designers and applied in quite narrow ways, but more and more today are being applied to almost every aspect of business and society.
So I get from that straight off the bat that we're talking about something that is beyond just designing shiny, nice products and the aesthetics. And I know that I mentioned that because I guess for a lot of people out there who aren't designers, and this session is called about how to think like a designer, for a lot of people who aren't professional designers, that might be what they think of.
Yeah, I mean, it tends to be, it's what the media likes to talk about because it's visual, right? I mean, you can print in a newspaper or magazine lots of beautiful images of clothes or objects or houses, and we tend to think of design as being the aesthetic, emotional piece. But that's only one piece of it. In fact, my favorite definition of design is the one that Herbert Simon, the scientist and philosopher, computer scientist and philosopher, created quite a long time ago. Where he said, design is whenever human beings are being intentional about shaping their environment. In fact, he used a stone axe as the first example of design, when somebody back, thousands and thousands of years ago decided that if they chipped away at this piece of stone, that they could make a tool that was better for them than the thing that they would have just picked up off the ground. That was design, right? In fact, the principal lens through which that was designed was obviously functional. It's like, I want to make a better tool, but it ended up, of course, looking beautiful because it was fit for purpose. And I think we have a natural tendency to see things that are fit for purpose in a way that makes them attractive to us, aesthetically attractive. But no, I mean, if we think about really anything that's man-made in the world has to be designed, right? The only things that aren't designed are the things that occur naturally, the natural world, and we can either design those things with skill and intention and aspiration, and with an attempt to have them serve the needs of the individual, the needs of society as a whole, and perhaps, as we're talking about today, the needs of the planet, or not, and we can let it all be rather accidental, and then the outcomes are often unpredictable.
That's an interesting point you made about how the only things that aren't designed are perhaps natural phenomenon and natural systems. A lot of what we've heard throughout the diff so far, I mean, earlier on there was a session about systems thinking and about how we can take insights from living systems and apply them in a whole range of aspects. I mean, from the perspective of the circular economy, we would say that's a model that's inspired by living systems. So if those things haven't been designed yet, we'd like to, in some instances, move towards man-made systems that mimic them. How can we take those steps? How can we design in a way that captures some of the benefits of natural systems?
And this is one of the great challenges, of course. I mean, natural systems have evolved over millions or at least thousands of years, and really the tension that we have is we want to try and create equally complex, rich and sophisticated systems in orders of magnitude less time, right? I mean, we don't have the time to wait for physical systems to evolve naturally, and so we want to design them. However, when we design them, we have a great deal of difficulty incorporating the same levels of sophistication and complexity that natural systems can because of the time component. And I think that is one of the great challenges of design today, that as we move away from designing simple things like a glass or a cup, where we have a decent chance of understanding the system that wraps around it, although, of course, the further you step back, and I think you would argue this, the more complex that system becomes, to the point where it can become overwhelming. But as we start thinking about even more complex things than that, like a city or a healthcare system, or the way a certain... or an economy, exactly. Even then it seems almost hopeless because of the level of complexity. And I think one of the things that helps, or one of the many tools that help, are sort of principles that help guide decisions, so that we can make a lot of decisions relatively quickly. And for me, that's one of the great, one of the joyful things about the principles behind the circular economy. The principles themselves are relatively simple. Now, the implications of those principles might be quite complex, but the principles themselves are relatively simple, and that's the sort of thing that we need as designers in order to be useful. And I would argue that many of the earlier approaches that we took to topics like sustainability were not, the principles weren't simple. The principles were extremely complex and therefore very, very difficult to use in the process of design.
Well, that's so we've picked up on this overlap between design and the importance of design in a circular economy. One thing that, and you mentioned about how some of these problems can seem quite depressing at times. As where do you start and how do you begin to overcome some of the challenges? And one of the challenges that we see now with shifting the economy from a linear to a circular one is that there's all this linear lock-in. There's a level of inertia in moving the economy from linear to circular. How can design thinking, designers, how can they help overcome some of that lock-in?
Well, you know, a lot of the change that design drives in society is by making alternatives more attractive than the current choice, right? I mean, that's really what that's the power of design. The power of design is to explore alternative possibilities, make those real in some way or real enough that we can understand how attractive they are compared to our current our current choice or our current frame. And so I think what we have to do is to use design thoughtfully as we consider these goals of breaking these linear systems and somehow making them circular, and begin to imagine how they might occur in the world, in society, in such a way that they are actually more attractive economically, more attractive experientially. They make lives better for people, more attractive perhaps because they're fairer. Never mind that they're more sustainable, and in many ways, for me, sustainability is really an aspect of fairness. It's about fairness to future generations. So I think that's how we have to think about the role of design. And that's not always easy because again, these ideas rapidly get quite complex, and it's not always possible to know the implications. But it's this goal of creating choices that are more attractive than the things we have in front of us today. And when we look at as we understand more and more about the negative sort of downside outcomes of these linear systems that we have today, perhaps it gets a little easier to imagine creating choices that are more attractive.
I'm going to take one of our first questions that we've had in from the audience. It's from Kitty, who's asked a question that again picks up on some of the other themes that have come up during the diff, and one of them is around artificial intelligence. So Kitty said, how do you feel about the growing impact of artificial intelligence and design, something that's not directly man-made but not natural on the other hand? So some of these deep learning systems, I think there are signs that they can be somewhat self-sufficient and learn by themselves. So have you engaged with that sort of that trend, and what are your opinions on that?
I certainly wouldn't claim to have thought about any of this deeply, but I do. There are things that I find attractive about the idea of AI, and there are things that I find slightly worrisome about the ideas of AI. One of the things I find attractive about AI is that it actually might be possible to take some of the sort of evolutionary methods of exploring fit solutions, but compress the timescale in which that happens. Now we can already do that with software, right? So we can design software today that designs itself and improves, searches many choices, many options, and gets to the best, gets to fitter solutions faster than we could design them in a traditional sense. And I think that is attractive in certain circumstances, particularly when we're looking, for instance, for efficient solutions. So I think about when we're designing aerodynamic systems, we can use evolutionary AI software to explore millions of options to surfaces and in order to find ones that are fitter and more aerodynamic, for instance. And I think that's beneficial. And you end up with something that is better than we would have been able to design using other means. What I find slightly worrisome on the side of AI is that we have not yet figured out how to make AI sensitive to human needs that are not purely functional, right? So when we can describe an algorithm that says this, more aerodynamic efficiency is better than less aerodynamic efficiency, great. But when we're trying to ask a piece of AI software to make something that makes people feel better respected or better understood, then we don't know how to do that. We don't know how to write that algorithm, and therefore we probably also don't know how to create AI software that would get to that outcome. And yet that is one of the things that design can do, right? We can attempt to design things that are more respectful of the human being or more respectful of the environment. So I guess what I would say from that is that there are certain sort of probably more functionally driven, on the simpler side of the kind of outcomes that we're looking for from design that AI could be extremely useful for. And then there are the more complex, perhaps we might describe them as more human outcomes that it might be a while before AI is ready for.
Thanks. I hope that answered your question, Kitty. We've had a few questions in around. Well, I'd like to return to the kind of systems view and the economy piece a bit later, but we've had a few questions in quick succession about design as a career, as a discipline, and obviously as someone who's been in this field for some time, people clearly want to get your views on it. So firstly, we've had a question from Guneet, who said, as a design student on a student budget, how would you develop insights about other countries and cultures when you may not be able to experience them firsthand? And Guneet's doing product design at Plymouth University, so kind of perhaps at the first stages and thinking about these the international nature of design.
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I would say that I certainly, when I was a design student, which is an uncomfortably long time ago, in Newcastle in England, I had absolutely no idea how to gain insight about other parts of the world, and so I didn't try. To be really frank with you, I focused on things that I understood, or at least I thought I understood. Today, I think with so many of the tools that we have available, we can reach across oceans and reach across cultural divides and do a better job of understanding the views and experiences of other people. Some of it we can do because certainly the UK is a good example of a country that's becoming ever more culturally diverse, and so some of it we can do on our own doorstep, and some of it we can do through the use of social media, whether it's observing through tools like YouTube or other things where people are publishing their own perspectives and their own experiences, or things that are directly interactive platforms that may be co-creation platforms or platforms that allow people to meet and gather and learn from each other. So I mean, it's more possible to do today on a low budget than it's ever been possible. I'm not saying it's possible to have the very deepest insights. I still think there's a tremendous amount of value to immersing yourself in different cultures, and we at IDEO still spend an awful lot of our time on airplanes because it's worth going to different parts of the world. Perhaps not very circular, or perhaps not very efficient in terms of carbon footprint, but in terms of depth and quantity and richness of insight, it is amazing still how a few days and weeks in the real place with real people, how valuable that still is.
And also on the subject of inspiration, another question we've had in: as a D&T apprentice for 10+ years, where do I find advanced design thinking classes or inspiration?
Well, again, I mean, I think the state of the world is constantly improving in terms of access to interesting material on design thinking. Whether it's a lot of it's free. I mean, there are this whether it's material from the D School at Stanford or from our sister organization IDEO.org that has free courses in design thinking available that get run every so often, or things that you can pay for if you so desire. There's mountains of material out there. I certainly encourage people to go to this tool, IDEO.org's design kit, which is a toolkit for design thinking that has all kinds of methods, useful methods that are all free and available to be used however people wish. And there's many others that have developed that kind of material. So a quick search on the web will lead you to all kinds of great materials, I think.
So I guess part of what we're hearing is that there's a lot of inspiration out there with some of the scale of some of the challenges, and some of the questions coming in around some of these big challenges, and we will get to them. There's no shortage of inspiration for designers.
That's right. No shortage. In fact, it's slightly overwhelming, perhaps.
So, of course, a lot of people online won't be professional designers themselves, perhaps, and won't be perhaps used to the process that you go through in whether you're designing a product or a system or service. So, question we've had in from Joe: how do we prepare cynical people for failure? Iteration is a key process in the application of design thinking. How do we balance the need to iterate and often fail to get to the right outcome with the need to bring people along to this new idea of a circular economy?
Well, I think there's a lovely, there's some sort of beauty in the notion of designing for the circular economy using a circular process, which is what design is. I mean, we have a habit of describing processes, knowledge-based processes, as linear, but many of them aren't, and design most certainly isn't. Design is a circular process, or at the very least a spiraling process. I don't talk about failure when I talk about iterations of design. I talk about learning, right? I mean, the whole idea of design is we need to learn how to get to the best idea as rapidly as we can, and we do that through going through iterations. And so things not working is one of the most valuable forms of learning. It's not failure, because it's only a failure if that's where you intended to stop. So if your plan was to stop at that point and it doesn't work, then yeah, right, fail. But if one doesn't plan to stop, but one plans to iterate and continue to iterate, then how can it be failure? It's learning, and that learning, the more you get of it, the more valuable it is. And I would say that one of the myths, perhaps, that evolved in the Industrial Revolution and the sort of approach to mass manufacture was this idea of sort of design and launch, that you fixed the design of something, you launched it out in the world, and then you were done, right? Because that meant there was a moment in which you stopped, right? But with almost everything that we design today, and more things, and I think in the future it will be everything, design will never stop. And there'll be multiple reasons for that. We can already see it. You can already see it if you take software as an example, because of the nature of software, in that as it accretes knowledge and data, it continuously evolves. So software these days, the way we design software, it gets smarter over time. Even if you don't do anything, it gets smarter over time. But of course, if you're clever about the way you design software, you get enormous benefit of the way it gets smarter over time. And so the design never stops. You keep designing software for as long as it's in the world. And I think that's going to be true of everything that we design. It'll be true of hardware, because for instance, we'll be able to use techniques like 3D printing to constantly evolve the form of an object, let's say, a hardware object. Or we'll use self-assembly to slightly change the nature of an object over time as it gets smarter, as it understands its environment in better ways. So I think one of the mindset shifts that is necessary for design and designers and engineers and everybody else involved in the world of making stuff, as we move to this idea of circular economy, is to shift away from the idea that design stops at some point to the notion that design never stops, and therefore learning never stops, and therefore in theory you never have failure, right? That may be a little bit of an exaggeration, but if you're learning, you're not failing.
Thanks. We've had a question that does bring us back to that kind of big picture view. So what are your priority areas that we should focus on to enable learners to see design as an enabler in solving more of our global challenges? And how can we inspire a generation to see creativity as the architects for some global solutions?
Well, I think, to some degree, we have to shift the attention of more creative people from relatively trivial problems to relatively more important problems, right? I think that for no bad reasons, but for all kinds of reasons, the incumbency of our industrial economy takes an awful lot of attention of creative people, designers, creative marketers, people who are thinking about the messages we're getting out into the world as well as the stuff we're putting into the world. And we have to shift that attention somewhat to different problems and different versions of the future. One of the tricks to that, I think, is to get those who are influential, often that's business leaders, to increase the amount of attention they give to the future compared to the present. I think that we tend to go through cycles, and if I look back 30 years or so to when I was just first entering my design career, it seemed like there was a little bit more attention given to the future, and that may have just been a moment in time because of the ascendancy of science. Things like the Apollo space program and many other things were sort of like, we're making the future seem quite attractive. And also, we were ignoring a lot of the complexities of the present, so we could spend more attention on the future. I think what's happened in the intervening period is we've come to understand how immensely complex the present is, and therefore we give it a lot more of our attention. And the future doesn't seem quite so attractive in some ways. I think it's maybe time for that pendulum swing to go back the other way a little bit, and for us to spend more of our creative energy on the future, or the future we would like to create. And again, it's why I find ideas like circular economy attractive, because they allow us to think about the future in quite different ways, in attractive ways, in ways that are appealing. So two things: we need to get decision makers, CEOs and the like, to spend more of their time focusing on the future, and then as creative people, we need to spend a bit more of our time working on the questions, the challenges that are more systemic in nature, and that have a chance of feeding that future in a positive way.
It's obviously important to think about the future, but it seems that increasingly, or what we're wrapped up in some of the tensions of the present system. And Steve's picked out one of them in the questions. He said that capitalism often holds up a competitive equilibrium between suppliers, demand, and price as the ideal market condition to which all industries should aspire. Others see monopolization as the ideal position from which to operate and as the perfect breeding ground for positive innovation. So I guess he's saying that by generating some cash, you can invest it in innovative projects. He uses the example of Google in looking at self-driving cars, for example, and other innovations. So what do you see, Steve's question, what do you see as the most beneficial environment to drive circular innovation? Competitive industry or monopolies?
I'm no economist, and so everything I say here comes with a very big caveat as definitely amateur. But I'm tempted to default to the Churchillian quote, which I think is, he said capitalism is the worst system except for all of the others. I might qualify that a little bit and say, actually, I think he said democracy is the worst system of government except for all the others. Sorry, so I misquoted. I think I might say that democratic capitalism is the worst economic system except for all of the others. And I think there are many forms of capitalism, right? Again, I'm no expert, but I have some good friends who are economists, and they've helped educate me a little bit. And I think that this notion of democratic capitalism that learns to balance the needs of society, the needs of all of us, and the benefits of capitalism is what we're really searching for. And there are even versions of that. I mean, you could argue there's a sort of a more socially weighted version of democratic capitalism, which is what we tend to see in Western Europe, and there's a more kind of business-focused version of democratic capitalism that actually has been given a big shove towards shareholder capitalism in America, which is not necessarily great. But somewhere in there, there's a right balance. And which means that neither of those two extremes that John, I think, just asked about would be desirable, right? No, you do not want out and out vicious competition, because that tends to drive everything down to the lowest common denominator, where anything but price is not on the table for choice, right? And that tends to externalize a lot of the issues that we actually need to internalize into our business system. So that's a problem. And equally, monopolies, pure monopolies, drive out innovation ultimately, because as the economists say, they become rent-seeking. They are rent-seeking. And so some amount of monopolization that gives you some amount of pricing power allows you to explore innovation in interesting ways, which I think you could argue that's what Google has been taking advantage of. But we have a system that before long starts to counterbalance that. It's called regulation, right? And it's called the European government, and it's called the SEC and other people that start to regulate. And that's healthy. And so it's not a simple either or. It's some appropriately dynamic balance where we can have a reasonable chance of supporting the needs of society, the benefits of innovation, and where we create wealth for individuals and society, because we know that ultimately benefits everybody. And then there's the whole big question, which is, the challenge I don't think anybody's figured out yet, which is, so what? Right now, the only way we have of measuring economic improvement is this idea of growth. And growth ultimately, of course, is unsustainable, and that's a big question for the economists to figure out.
Sorry, were you saying that growth is unsustainable? That any sort of growth is unsustainable?
Well, growth of consumption is unsustainable, right? Because eventually we consume everything, and then we've got nothing left. And so, I mean, you all probably have much better ideas of how we describe things like circular economy ideas that create good forms of growth rather than bad forms of growth. But perhaps it's
consumption. Perhaps consumption isn't the right word. I know. Exactly. I don't consume this laptop or in front of me, or these lights or anything like that. So perhaps that isn't the right word at all.
I would agree with you. I think you're probably right.
So we've seen something that's really come through in this session so far is just quite how far design and design thinking can reach. But sometimes it feels like companies are really, in recent years, have been chucking the word design around, and good design, and how the importance of design. They've been chucking it around at every opportunity. Isn't that just devaluing the term and devaluing the practice?
Yes, it runs the risk of doing so, just like anything else. Right? We have a habit in our very talkative society of devaluing everything because we talk about it too much and we don't do enough of it. And so design falls into the same, runs the risk of this, of having of the same thing. For me, the thing to focus on is this idea of mastery, right? That in order to get the most out of design, we have to master it. We have to master design thinking, and the more we master it, the better outcomes we'll create. Just like, the more a musician masters their instrument, the better the outcomes will be. The more a soccer team masters the game, the more successful they will be. I think this is a moment where we actually need to focus on this idea of mastery. It's not enough just to understand the concepts of design. We have to constantly learn, practice and master the various aspects of design, just like we have to learn, practice, and master many other aspects of society and the things and the roles and skills we need in society. So ultimately, I mean, when I talk to organizations about how they might increase their capacity around design thinking, I talk about this idea of creative competitiveness, right? That either for an individual or an organization, the ability to accept and embrace new ideas and create new ideas will be a fundamental piece of an organization or an individual's future competitiveness, because we're in a world that's changing ever more quickly in ever more unpredictable ways. And so that doesn't come from a mere acknowledgement of a set of concepts. It comes from deeply understanding the tools, the skills, the mindsets. It comes through practice. And ultimately, those that have practiced and those that master the skills will leverage design most successfully.
I just want to make sure we get to our last few questions. We've got around about 5 minutes left, and we've had some good questions in. So a couple more around kind of the how to build and embed design in business and in learning and in society. So Avelian said, do you think it's essential that different disciplines such as art, science, and engineering work together in designing solutions for today's challenges?
I do. I mean, one of the things that we've done at IDEO successfully, I think, is we've tried to create an environment where people from different disciplines. I mean, we have scientists at IDEO, we have business people at IDEO, we have creative people at IDEO, but we all use design together, right? So design is a very useful collaborative medium. Mind you, so is science, and so are politics, and there are other things that we've invented as a species that are good for collaboration. So I'm not saying design is the only one. But design is a good one, right? Because it turns out that you can learn the skills of design and you can master them over time, and it's a great way of collaborating in order to create new ideas. But there's a huge amount of value in bringing these different experiences and skill sets to creative problems. And many of what I think of the greatest designers that we've had in our history, whether it be Steve Jobs or Isambard Kingdom Brunel or Elon Musk, are people that seem to understand the intersections between things that we might think of as being technical and scientific, and things that we might think of as being business-like, and things that we might think of as being creative and design-like. And so it's those points of intersection where the most opportunity arises. It's also a difficult place to work. And often a confusing place to work, but one which personally I get a lot of enjoyment out of, and was the reason I went into design in the first place. I was somebody who was not well understood when I was at school, because I enjoyed doing physics and art and history, and I wanted to figure out how to bring all those things together. And that's one of the problems we have today, is that our schooling system, for instance, tends to encourage us to go into silos. Rather than to cross these boundaries, which is where so much creativity resides.
I mean, I wish we had time to get into the education question, because I'm sure some of our viewers would enjoy that as well. But we've got loads of questions coming in, even with a few minutes to go. But we'll try and get through a couple more. So Nina said, what would your advice be on switching between designing and operating processes in companies? For example, what, in your view, would be the start or stop triggers for initiating or leaving design mode?
I think more and more in business, these things run in parallel rather than sequentially. The only difference is you can projectize the design mode. You can't projectize the operating mode. The operating mode is continuous. And so you can have little bursts of design as projects that go alongside the operating, but more and more, I mean, it's no longer possible. We don't have the luxury of time to be able to stop everything and say, now we're going to design for a bit and then start everything again. We have to be doing design alongside, so it's parallel, not serial.
Thanks. It's a really clear answer. So we had a question in earlier on, which was what for you is the greatest example of design today and why? And any thoughts on that? It is a huge question.
Yeah, I mean, yes, there are so many different answers to that.
I have
I
a more
won't.
specific one. If you
Yeah, give me a more specific one.
okay.
Otherwise, I'll just end up. The simple question that is, whatever I designed last is the thing that I most enjoy talking about. But that's not always a good answer to the question. So go ahead and.
So the refined version is: can you share your favorite example of how design thinking has been used in a circular economy?
Wow, that's a good one. But even then, I'm not sure. I mean, so. You've probably got better examples of it than I have, really. I think design's only just coming to the circular economy. Although I will say, I don't know if this is really an answer, but maybe it's a better answer to the first half of that question. Is something that we've been working on a lot recently is education. We mentioned education a minute ago, and as an example of what might be possible with the circular economy, we had a great chance a couple of years ago to design a completely new school system. Everything. We designed the curriculum, the physical schools, the technology that was coming to the schools, the way that the teachers were trained, every aspect of the system for a school system in Peru, and managed to create a low-cost, very scalable, very sustainable school system that so far, we built the first 30 schools, is generating educational outcomes that are 3 to 4 times better than the national standards. And that's not circular in the pure sense of the word, but it does show the power of designing systems. When you can, so instead of just being asked, hey, can you design a new classroom, or can you design a new school campus, or can you design a new edtech solution, we got to design the whole thing. And because of that, we could find all kinds of economies and opportunities that ended up with a low-cost, scalable, sustainable, pretty successful school system. And that, for me, is the opportunity we're looking for. That's where we have to break out of the kind of existing linear systems that we have in industry and business and give creative people the opportunity to look at more of the system and look for different ways of putting that system together to create these kinds of like pretty significant outcomes.
Thanks, Tim. And then Valeria has said, and I think this is a good one to get your thoughts on as we come to a close. Valeria has said that it's been said that design thinking has come of age. What is its future? What are the new challenges?
I think a lot of them are to do with what I just talked about before, which is we cannot stop at design thinking as an idea. We have to continually drive forward in mastering design thinking and its application in many of these areas of importance, right? So I used to think that any designer could tackle any problem, and I think that's partially true. But we also get something out of designers building expertise and knowledge about particular problem sets, and so that takes time. So for me, the future of design is about mastery. It's about focusing on particular issues, whether it be the circular economy, whether it be the way we think about our communities and cities, whether it be the way we think about our education systems, our food systems. The mastering the application of design to those kinds of challenges there are decades of work to do there, and opportunity for millions of creative people to contribute. It really is a very, very big pie that we can all share in if we so desire.
Well, there you go. There's the opportunity has been laid out there. There's a massive opportunity for you to be part of redesigning the future using design thinking. Thank you to Tim for answering so many great questions today and spending the time to chat with us. Hopefully, we've learned we've touched upon what design thinking can achieve, alongside some quite practical advice about where to find inspiration, how to embed design thinking in daily lives, whether that's in business, society, education, and so on. We've also heard why it's important, and how design thinking is much beyond products and perhaps even beyond services at times, to a way of thinking that can help us take on some of the wicked problems, the grand challenges of today. So I hope you've enjoyed the time Tim spent with us today. What's on next at the Diff then? Well, our next headliner is tomorrow. It's L. Hunter Lovins, who'll be talking about natural capitalism and the possibility of a global system that works towards a prosperous future for the economy and the environment. Tomorrow is the first of our Disruptive Innovation Festival language days, with sessions all day in French on the collaborative economy, circular economy, universal income, and more. It starts at 8 in the morning GMT and finishes at 6 in the evening. If you like design and you've enjoyed this session, then tomorrow at 5 o'clock GMT, Andrew Goldberg from iFixit will be leading a live product teardown of a pair of Nexus phones, covering issues such as disassembly and repairability along the way. Teardown sessions were massively popular last year at the Diff, so make sure you don't miss that one. And finally, both this headline act with Tim and yesterday's session with Robin Chase on the collaborative economy, along with a host of other sessions from week 1, are available to catch up at thinkdiff.co right now. That's all from me and from Tim tonight. Thank you so much for joining us at this Disruptive Innovation Festival headline act, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you. Good night.